I know saying insulin resistance saves your life sounds a bit weird, but once you delve deep into it, it does actually make sense. That's not clickbait. And you'll understand exactly why it's a true statement. To explain the cause of so-called insulin resistance and really give lay people a full understanding in such a way that you can take control of your metabolic health without relying on doctors like myself, and yes, I am one. I'm going to go into analogies that even kids can understand and then equate those to the bioenergetics surrounding this concept that we label as insulin resistance. Apologies if you find the analogies patronizing, but if you do, then clearly they're not meant for you and you can just skip ahead. I'm going to use them so that even kids in school can watch this and learn it as early as possible in life. When Bruce from the film Matilda was forced to eat cake, he loved it to start with. But eventually there was so much cake put in him that his body naturally signaled him to stop, with things like feelings of being sick and maybe some abdominal pain, etc., etc. The body recognized it's dangerous to have more, so it sent these signals. If someone does that force feeding to you, you'll get to a point where you physically put your hands up to block your mouth even. There was a protective process that prevented further food from going into his mouth in order to save him from serious issues. I'm sure this is pretty easy to understand. When we charge a battery, there's only so much charge you can put into it. Now, I'm not going to go into what charge is, because we'd be here all day discussing whether anyone can actually define an electron. But for what it's worth, if you try to force more charge than is storable into a battery somehow, like in a car, I think it's pretty safe to say that something potentially dangerous is going to happen, maybe even some sort of explosion if the battery is big enough and your charging process is strong enough too. Both of these are pretty easy analogies to follow, I'm sure. They represent trying to put chemical or electrical energy into something that has a fixed capacity of what it can take in. But when it comes to diabetes, people think insulin resistance is the cause. Insulin resistance, as you're about to see from transferring these analogies, is the way your cells save your life, like Bruce's body making him feel sick to get him to stop, because the cells only have a fixed capacity of what they can take in, just like Bruce's stomach or a hypothetical battery. Let me explain, and I'll try to use layman's terms as much as possible again. When we eat carbohydrates, this puts externally sourced glucose into our bloodstream. In other words, it's glucose not from our own body making it on purpose to be in the bloodstream, which can come about during things like exercise. This is the most potent signal that we have to tell cells in the pancreas, called beta cells, to make insulin. Alpha cells are something else. They make glucagon, which is a different topic for a different day. There are other things that can also signal insulin production too, but they're going to be less potent, like certain amino acids like leucine, to name just one. But dietary carbohydrates are the most potent inducer of insulin production than things like leucine or certain amino acids. Now, once the insulin is around, people jump to thinking that glucose is then going into the cells, and that's great. This is where you get common misunderstandings, and I'm going to challenge your thoughts on this. If the cell needs energy to carry its job, then glucose, which provides energy, going into it can be beneficial. But what if the cells don't need more energy? When we feed Bruce, it can be fine if he's hungry, but what about when he's so full that he wants to throw up because his body needs to take drastic measures to get him to stop? If we charge a battery when it's empty, I'm sure it's fine. But if it's charged and then we somehow try to get a big machine to overload it beyond what it needs, do you think you're going to be safe during that process? Let's pretend we don't eat any carbs, so there's no externally sourced blood glucose. How do you think people like myself have a blood glucose level when we eat no carbs? Well, we have one because our body can make glucose by itself whenever needed using a process called gluconeogenesis, glucose new make. And guess what? It makes exactly the right amount that's needed. We feed Bruce just the right amount to satisfy his hunger but not make him sick. We charge the battery just the right amount to reach 100% and then stop. Our body knows what level is needed at all times as a result of millions of years of evolution. This is why when I do exercise, my continuous glucose monitor shows my blood glucose rising, even when I didn't eat carbs, because my body senses a need for more energy due to exercise, and then it decides to produce some by breaking down glucose stores called glycogen and then charging my battery only enough to reach 100% by sending the perfect amount of glucose to cells using the bloodstream. But it only sends the exact amount needed. But what happens when we put more than is needed into the bloodstream, for example, by using externally sourced carbohydrates? Well, your cell has been supplied with enough already, thanks to gluconeogenesis. So now we're forcing in more than is technically needed by forcing glucose from an area of high concentration, i.e. the bloodstream, to an area of relatively low concentration, i.e. the cell, inside the cell. In other words, it moves down its concentration gradient, which is a technical term. Water moves in the same way, down concentration gradients or water potential gradients inside organisms. But when more water is needed, is forced into a cell, it can actually damage the cell. This concept of putting in more than is needed being damaging is the same for glucose too. I know some may not believe me, but you can see the proof of this in your own body if you wish, so you can test to see if it's true. Just keep putting in more and more carbohydrates in your mouth and watch your glucose levels sustain for long periods of time because insulin isn't clearing it. A crude example again is Bruce feeling sick to stop more cake coming in order to prevent damage. That feeling of being sick makes him close his mouth in the analogy, and it has an equivalent in the cell. When the cell feels sick from too much cake, glucose, it closes its mouth too. It closes it to stop more glucose entering. And it happens because glucose represents energy, and cells, like batteries, can only cope with so much at one time without getting damaged. The mouth closing on the cell is called a GLUT4, which stands for glucose transporter 4. This cellular mouth shuts out glucose because it doesn't want any anymore. And when that happens, insulin can no longer open this mouth to put more glucose in. You see, we have protection mechanisms in ourselves to make sure too much of anything doesn't come in, whether it's something like water, which isn't done with GLUT4, by the way, or in this case, glucose. It's what prevents cell death, or if you want to know the technical term, cytolysis. This is why so-called insulin resistance is a mechanism of saving your life. It's a mechanism that prevents cell death from catastrophic bioenergetic instability, to use a technical phrase for a second, forgive me. Happens because of an observable phenomenon called the Randall cycle, discovered by Sir Philip Randall and published in 1963. It's a really important discovery in the field of metabolism, but it's too big to go into for this video right now, otherwise it'll be even longer than I planned it to be. Maybe I can do it in another video sometime. But in short, in a nutshell, it exists to stop glucose from damaging cells from being inside them in too high a quantity relative to the ideal amount. So I always teach my patients to realize that this thing that we term insulin resistance, it's not a pathology or a problem, and it certainly isn't the cause of diabetes. It's a protection mechanism that's meant to occur in order to save our cells. It's a normal, it's a required biological pathway that's been selected for over millions of years to ensure our survival and subsequent optimal health and function and ability to reproduce. What happens when we shut that GLUT4 mouth then? Well, apart from being given the label of someone who's insulin resistant now, that's not the end of the story, because if the door is shut, the glucose has to go somewhere, even if it can't go into the cells. The cake still has to go somewhere, even if Bruce doesn't want to eat it. Does someone else have it, or does it end up in the bin? Sorry if the analogies are a bit patronizing, but I'm kind of speaking to my teenage self here and telling him things I wish I'd known when I was younger. Well, basically, the glucose ends up with someone else. Specifically, when it hangs around in the bloodstream, it can then cause damage to cells of the circulatory system. And this happens because these cells are more able to be sacrificed because the cells themselves are a little bit less complex in structure, and so they're replaced more often, partly because being less complex means they're easy to make. So a library book that gets replaced very often can take damages to its pages because it will be replaced by a new one very soon anyway. Those cells in the circulation system are replaced more rapidly, so they can take some short-term sacrifice to their pages before the librarian gets a replacement copy brought in a few months' time from the bone marrow. If the new ones get damaged too, and it just never stops, then obviously you've got chronic issues and your health is just going to decline like this. when we look at evolution, just to state the obvious for a second, bear with me, we didn't have Uber Eats 100,000 years ago to have any amount of food, any number of times placed in our laps with practically zero energy spent to obtain it. So we clearly haven't evolved with repeated or constant external glucose loading on the blood as a Darwinian positive selection pressure. So we're not adapted, in my opinion only, for what it's worth, to be eating carbs all day non-stop. And we can maintain our blood glucose with great consistency even without eating carbs in the diet. Hence my consistent glucose level without eating any carbs. And if you think about it, for those that disagree, which you're welcome to, of course, the very existence of the process of gluconeogenesis is the ability, i.e. the ability we have to make glucose anytime we need and always in the exact amount required from other materials. That wouldn't have existed if we needed to eat carbohydrates. Overall, the disease process or the problem in things like diabetes isn't the concept of insulin resistance. Instead, it's the thing that causes that GLUT4 mouth in the cell to close, which is externally sourced glucose, making blood levels of glucose rise more than the body deems necessary in such a way that the cell then needs to protect itself from your diet and lifestyle choices. And again, you can try this yourself to try and prove me wrong if you wish. Just overeat carbs, watch your insulin resistance take form to gain a diabetes type 2 diagnosis, then stop the carbs, and then watch the insulin-related processes normalize again so that you're no longer diabetic. This is why there's no magic supplement that reverses diabetes. You can take a supplement, but if your battery is still being overcharged, then it still won't let any more electricity in, will it? If you're still putting carbs in your mouth, then the GLUT4 will still be closed to any glucose that turns up. I really urge you to stop believing in supplements that can suddenly cure things. Sure, supplements and nutraceuticals can have a place in someone's diet at times, but the most powerful anti-aging thing anyone can do is to just eat right. Supplements and things are great ways for companies to make extra cash most of the time. There's very few that are actually credible and that I personally have seen make significant differences to my patients based on their feedback. Maybe I can do a video on some supplements one day. I did make a video on them a while back, but even then, that was only in the context of someone that absolutely needs to take those things. If the diet's right, then you don't need to buy anything extra. But going back to the glucose, please be aware that when you measure things like HbA1c on a blood test to measure the glucose level control, it might be a decent way to get a very rough, recent historical picture of your glucose metabolism. But the issue you have there is that it doesn't tell you about fructose, which has its own set of damaging characteristics in the body. And where we find glucose in nature, we find fructose too, all the time. And as to what ultimately happens to the glucose after the point in the story that we got to, when it hangs around in the bloodstream because GLUT4 is closed, in terms of things like being turned into fat and how the liver's involved and why fructose is basically poison, how triglycerides come into the picture. I think I've spoken quite long here already, so I'll leave that for part 2. But quickly, for those that don't believe me, because your doctor has never told you any of this, well, there are many reasons for that. Firstly, we're not taught the Randall cycle in our undergraduate. Well, I certainly wasn't anyway. And secondly, you don't need to hear from a doctor what you can see with your own 2 eyes to be true. Try a CGM and watch your blood glucose levels maintain even without dietary carbohydrates. Ideally, change your diet over 2 to 3 months if you want to do it safely. But on average, it takes me 3 to 4 weeks to completely reverse someone's type 2 diabetes nowadays. I'll leave a picture on screen here of a before and after of fasted insulin results of one of my patients from last week, who's now off all medication, so you can see for yourself exactly what happens.